Hi, Barely Sapient here. Today I'm going to give an introduction and a slight review of the performance of CachyOS and compare it a bit to Bazzite, which has been a great gaming distro. So CachyOS has gotten a lot of buzz lately for its performance. Well, how does it perform on an older system? Well, to test this out, I have played some games and taken some results on my system that has a Ryzen 5 1600AF, an Nvidia Quadro M4000, and 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. So let's see how it performs on maybe a Frankenstein of an older system. As a gamer that has gamed on Windows for years and years, switching over to Linux last year was one of the most interesting things I've ever done. Now, I normally use Linux Mint for my main system. It's still a do-boot system because there are a few games, mostly multiplayer, that only work in Windows. Now, I don't play very many multiplayer games, so it's not a big issue. Recently having used Bazzite, it seems to be a very intuitive and easy system to use. CachyOS is not that. It's a little bit harder to use than Bazzite is. However, it is not that difficult to install CachyOS and to get Steam up and running. First thing you're going to want to do if you want to install CachyOS is look up CachyOS on your preferred search provider. Click on CachyOS website, hit the download button. Yes, you want the desktop edition. They do have a handheld version apparently, and then you have a number of choices. You can do direct, SourceForge, magnet, torrent. You can also check the checksum if you need to after you've downloaded. That's actually a good idea. After you've downloaded the ISO, just use Rufus in Windows to make a bootable USB, or ImageWriter in Linux to do the same. When you boot from the USB stick, you'll be welcomed, eventually, you'll be welcomed to the Welcome to CachyOS screen, a dialog box. You're going to want to hit the Launch Installer button. At some point the Cachy installer will start. This is when you will pick your language, your preferred language. I have a UK keyboard, so that's why I'm picking British English. Hit next, then you're going to select your time zone. This is all standard stuff for Linux installation so far. After you pick your time zone, you're going to hit next and pick your keyboards, or just a keyboard depending. Next, after that, you're going to select a partition. This is where you're going to select a drive to install it on a device. Whether you're going to install it alongside or on a completely different disk is up to you. I chose a completely different disk, and I'm replacing the partition on it. It just so happens to be unformatted at this point, but that's what I did. Hit next when you've done that. Just make sure you're on the right device for the EFA partition, or the EFI partition as well. This is one of the nicer things about CachyOS, is you can choose which desktop environment in the install process you want to use. Most of them you have to go download a separate ISO file for it. So that's kind of nice. Now I chose the Plasma desktop, or also known as KDE, because I particularly like that one. It's the one that Bazzite uses, by the way. And then this will give you additional things that you can install along with it. And this is your Packages tab on the install process. And this is kind of nice as well. If you want to install an extra desktop, if you want to try something else as well, you have the option to do that. If you have, well, I guess, an HP printer for some reason, then drivers for that. Next thing you're going to do is put in your name and your login screen name. I use Barely Sapient for the channel. I picked a a usable password. It's going to make you do that as well. Now, you could log in automatically without asking for a password, but I never do that. Next, you're going to check everything over to see if you're installing to the right device, and check again to see if you're installing to the right EFI file system on your computer as well, where that's located, so that you can boot properly. Now, this computer already has Bazzite installed on it, so those two aren't going to play. Those two play nice together. Usually Linux installs do. It's usually Windows that really throws a monkey wrench in that. Next, you're going to hit the install button, and it will install the operating system for you at that point. Hit install now, and this is what it's going to be for about 20 minutes of what it took on this machine anyway. Once you have finished the installation and restarted from the live environment, you can boot CachyOS. You'll enter your password to enter if you've set it up that way, like I did. And you will boot into the KDE desktop environment if you chose that one. I choose it because I like that environment, as I've said before. You'll be greeted with this: welcome to CachyOS. KDE has a start button very similar to the Windows start button, and since this is a KDE desktop environment, it will have a lot of the normal KDE apps. Some will be specific to CachyOS himself. It does come with Firefox pre-installed, just like most distributions of Linux does these days. Like most distros, this CachyOS does have a package manager. It's called the CachyOS package installer. It also has a kernel manager, so that's kind of nice. Alacrity is the name of its terminal, and when you open that up, it gives you a brief system specs. That's kind of cool. Unlike Bazzite, Steam does not come pre-installed, but it's not that hard to install. If you go back to the Welcome to CachyOS screen, you're going to want to hit the Apps and Tweaks button. Then you're going to want to install gaming packages. This is how you install Steam. It's going to ask for your password. It's going to ask you for some options. I just picked the first option for both of these that come up. And then it's going to list a whole bunch of packages that you need for gaming, and then it's going to ask you to proceed with the installation. Hit Y for yes, and it'll start downloading a bunch of stuff that you need to start gaming, including Steam, including Proton and Wine and for a games launcher and that sort of thing. It's not that hard to install these things and get to gaming. It's actually pretty quick. It's not that bad, actually. Not that bad at all. After it's done doing its thing in the terminal, it'll start updating Steam, and after that you can click on the Steam icon to log in. Simple, right? The system tested today is an AMD Ryzen 5 1600AF, although this terminal doesn't detect the AF bit. The GPU is an Nvidia Quadro M4000. It's a little bit faster than a GTX 960 and a little bit slower than a GTX 970, but it has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so it's an interesting card as far as that's concerned. This has 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, and I installed it on a SATA SSD. So how does CachyOS perform on aging hardware? How does it perform against Bazzite on said hardware? Well, let's take a look. So Assassin's Creed Origins is a very demanding title that is about the same age as the hardware being tested. So which OS comes out on top, CachyOS or Bazzite? So these are the test settings for Assassin's Creed Origins. It's at 1080p native. Resolution modifier is at 100%. VSync is turned off, of course. And graphics are an overall quality setting of medium, and all of the settings that it sets for that in-game. So Assassin's Creed Origins does have an in-game benchmark, and I used it. This was the score in Bazzite. This was the score in CachyOS. So at these settings on this hardware in both Bazzite and CachyOS, the in-game benchmark likes to hang around the mid to low 40s. Okay, so let's check and see actual gameplay for performance in Bazzite. Looks like it's in the high 30s, low 40s, and this is a busy area in town. Sometimes it'll get up to the high 50s, depending, especially if you look up, huh? But yes, performance could be made better if you lowered the resolution or some of the detail settings. Okay, so I'm in that same area in CachyOS, and it is, well, it looks much the same type of performance, just like the in-game benchmark. Yeah, I don't think there's going to be much difference in performance between these two OSs on this game. Okay, so they perform almost exactly the same, carbon copies of each other on this game. So Horizon Zero Dawn Complete Edition is a more challenging game to run, but is playable on this hardware. And let's see how this game stacks up in these two operating systems. To test performance, I used these settings at both 900p and 1080p. I have the texture set to Ultra because the Nvidia Quadro M4000 does have a large VRAM buffer. Other than that, everything is set to low except for clouds and ambient occlusion are set to medium. Anti-aliasing is set to FXAA. Using the in-game benchmark in Horizon Zero Dawn in CachyOS, the game averages 30 frames per second, and if you look at the graphs, it's pretty stable. Maintains roughly around 30 frames per second. There's little dips and valleys as well as slight spikes, but not anything concerning. But it's just barely hitting 30, almost too close. Because it's so close in the in-game benchmark, it seemed wise to test it in battle, in gameplay, where the demands might be more than the benchmark is leading on here. It does seem playable, but you can see the gameplay does drop into the mid-20s at times, and this is just fighting two opponents in game. So yeah, 1080p is not realistic at these settings. Lowering the resolution to 900p ups the frame rate to 38 from 30 and gives you a little bit of a buffer. This is that exact same area. The only difference is the game is at 900p, and as you can see, despite the battle, the frame rate doesn't drop below 30, and that extra buffer helps out with the performance, and the controls were a little bit more responsive too because of that. In Bazzite, Ryzen Zero Dawn in the in-game benchmark can't even maintain 30 frames per second. In fact, it goes all the way down to 27. This is Bazzite, again at 1080p, and while the frame rate is somewhat stable, it's in the 20s, and response time on my controller was, well, hard to play. It made it hard to play. In Bazzite, this is at 900p on the in-game benchmark, and it's only at 32 frames per second. This is Bazzite in that same area against those same enemies. It looks like it holds its own at 900p. It does dip down below 30 once in a while, but it's certainly playable. It's kind of the same almost as CachyOS is at 1080p, just barely holding on. So on this hardware, CachyOS playing Horizon Zero Dawn is definitely the winner. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077. To test this game in both OSs, I used AMD FSR 2.1. It's set to the auto setting. Image sharpening is at 0.50. Texture quality is at high. Crowd density was at medium. Ambient occlusion is off. All other settings are set to low or off. This game is just too demanding to even consider running at 1080p on this hardware. So, testing was done at 720p. Well, the Cyberpunk 2077 in-game benchmark is a great tool to measure performance between two different systems. When your system is at the edge of playability, it's not quite so useful a tool. You just have to go in and play the game at a demanding area of something like that instead. So I did both. I tested both OSs at 720p with the before-mentioned settings. Bazzite got a score of 42.24 frames per second. It did just slightly dip below 30 for its minimum. CachyOS did score slightly higher with frames per second of 42.88. So pretty much within margin of error there. Its minimum was 30.76, so just slightly higher than 29.5. So really not much difference. In Bazzite, going to the busier areas of town and starting a fight, frame rate did stay above 30, so it's perfectly playable. It's not the best experience in the world, but it is playable in Bazzite. Doing the same sort of thing in CachyOS, the frame rate numbers were slightly higher again, but the gameplay seemed indistinguishable from Bazzite, so I can't really give CachyOS a win here. Rise of the Tomb Raider is one of those weird games that will perform better on the Linux port on older hardware, performs better on DX11 on older hardware as well in Windows, and if you are actually going to compare it in Proton, it performs better in DX11 than it does in DX12 as well. Unless you've got newer hardware. But since we're testing it on older hardware, yeah, let's see where this leads. Okay, so in both OSs, I tested Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, and I used a graphics preset of high. I didn't change any of the settings. Using the Linux port is the best way to run Rise of the Tomb Raider in Linux. It's just better than Proton. In the CAN benchmark in CachyOS, it scored 47.71 frames per second, and its lows were in the teens and mid-20s depending on which part of the CAN benchmark you were in. Overall, not a great score. In Bazzite, Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, high settings, runs considerably better than it did in CachyOS. It gets a score of 54.17 frames per second. And its lows are considerably higher. They're in the 30s, except for the one that's in the mid-20s, so much better. So in Bazzite OS, Rise of the Tomb Raider, this first part of the game where you're climbing a mountain and it's blizzard conditions, quite rough, right? And the frame rate is, well, mostly in the high 30s, low 40s, with some moments to get into the 50s. So this is the same part of the game in CachyOS, and it's about really the same. You get in high 30s, low 40s. Again, it's the same part of the game, so it looks like performance is actually the same. So Total War Warhammer is another game that's about the same age as this hardware. So it'll be interesting to see how it runs on the two operating systems. So I tested Total War Warhammer at 900p Ultra with anti-aliasing set to FXAA. At 900p Ultra, CachyOS put up a good fight, and it looks like, I mean, it's still going to be playable. This is a turn-based strategy game most of the time, and just real-time strategy for battle. So yeah, maybe the real-time strategy bit's going to be a little dicey at times. It did average almost 35 frames per second, but you can see some of the dips are in the high teens. Bazzite did a little better at 900p Ultra. Had less trouble maintaining above 30 frames per second. And you can see that here in the graph. It did dip down into the high 20s, but much better performance. It averaged almost 40 frames per second. And I tested it at 1080p with textures to Ultra, everything else to low or off, and it kept anti-aliasing at FXAA. At 1080p with all settings low except for textures at Ultra, CachyOS put up a strong performance, averaging above 70 frames per second and only dipping into the 50s a few times. At 1080p with the chosen settings, Bazzite also put up a strong performance. As you can see here, this might just be the best settings for this card. It only had 2 dips into the 50s. It looks like maybe even only 1. Slightly higher average frames per second, but still almost indistinguishable performance compared to CachyOS in this case. The Witcher 3, the Wild Hunt, came out in the same year as this GPU. Then it was a very demanding game, and with updates it still is. For The Witcher 3, I set the graphics preset to low and changed the texture quality to Ultra. The resolution was set to 720p. In Bazzite, at these settings, I kept getting these annoying large spikes with pauses in gameplay that were a bit annoying. In CachyOS in the same area, yeah, roughly similar frame rate, maybe a little bit lower as an average, but those spikes are not there. So CachyOS definitely wins in The Witcher 3, just on that. So what I've learned the last few days in installing this operating system and gaming on it is that it's actually pretty easy to set up for gaming. CachyOS is not as hard as some people make it out to be, I think. It's a little bit harder to use than Bazzite, but not by much. As far as gaming performance, well, there's sometimes better than Bazzite, sometimes worse, based on the games that I tested. I don't think you're gaining much on this older hardware. It might be much more performant on newer hardware than, say, Bazzite is. That might be the case, I'm not sure. But on this older hardware, an older Nvidia card that's basically a GTX 900 series, it's not. It's hit and miss. Now, its stability is a little bit concerning, however. In these few days, CachyOS has actually crashed on me at least twice that I can remember. And that was during a boot up. Both times. One was during the boot, and one was right after a boot. And both times it just reset the machine. So there might be some stability issues. Now, it hasn't done it actually during a game, but it might. I'm not sure. I've only been running it for 4 days now. So CachyOS will not rescue older hardware. despite its performance advantages that it might have on newer hardware. In my opinion, CachyOS is not a fit for older hardware. You're not going to get the advantage of bleeding edge support that you would want with newer hardware, and on top of it you still get the stability issues. That's kind of a mismatch, isn't it? Well, that's just my opinion. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.